The Wanda Vision show, being an excellent source of entertainment, should be watched by all for the enjoyment of many. And to this extent, it expresses the fundamental devotion to the concept in the War on David derived by the Confederates using military equipment in order to engage in their subversion for white supremacy communism. And that mechanism of the Confederates, who, having broken down from the use of direct force as a super minority of super predators, have the extreme minority position, but in the position of having engaged in fracturing and degrading themselves, that they might be reconstructed after they infected the system by the use of diverse factioning, engage in the infiltration of the government and its classified materials and gained access to the higher level value equipment, which is specifically used for the purposes of their white supremacy, as they are their own independent nation not loyal to the United States. The sales and distributions of their sense of superiority requires the specific attack on all constitutional functions, including the undermining of hate crimes as a punishable offense. Thus, they use their various subversions and dog whistles in order to manufacture the in conclusion for their social violence, economic violence, political violence, and other forms of bigotry enforced by their KKK contracts for their kangaroo courts, which are hyper-accelerated by the secrets, such as the artificial intelligence and automated systems which they have armed as weapons of war against the American civilian population, guilty of nothing, at which point their positions from their dog whistles are to hyper-exacerbate the excuses for their entry and subversion of rights, because their entire identity depends on the legitimizing of those functions. And thus, anything, no matter how legitimate it might pretend to be on the surface, which demands the function of the excuse to be able to do that, is a white supremacist terrorist operation, and thus a catastrophic public threat which must be purged with extreme force and retaliated against by those who support it, as they are malicious terrorist public threats, as an absolute threat to the United States national security. Any of those excuses are directly fraudulent on their face and are a fake pretense towards the legitimacy of the use of their military operations against the unarmed civilian populations. And having broken the Second Amendment position from SCOTUS in the use of weapons that the public do not have access to, has violated it and created an infinite variation on the use of military operating materials to be used on the civilian population, which are hyper exacerbated by the functions which they have arranged in their false flag operations, hyper accelerating their simulations, such as the ones demonstrated in Wanda Vision, except Wanda was not being nearly as malicious as the literal hate group. To that extent, what would the KKK do if they had Wanda Vision's power from the TV show? And the answer is exactly what they are currently doing. And thus, the function of people who are important would systemically be targeted in order to change their associations for social violence by attacking the right of the freedom of association, changing the fundamental justification of the association in order to materialize the alteration of the simulation, making it the accepted reality, at which point the best of friends in reality from law, are then separated by this delusion, and the reuniting of them would be the fundamental interest on both parties if they were from the side in reality. And the side in the simulation is under the delusion and would fundamentally become uncomfortable by the counter magic resisting the reentry into reality, manufacturing the systems of the consistent repulsion against the value they are both owed, and mysteriously want but don't understand wanting, feel ashamed of wanting, and retaliate against wanting, according to the counterspells engaged in the return to the simulation as a matter of the Wizard Council's concentration on the maintaining of their delusionary state. Which means, by definition, they aren't even allowed to make believe or pretend various possibilities in some kind of improv scenario where they would otherwise examine what that would functionally look like in an acceptable manner. Now, to that extent, that would, by definition, be retaliated against, as the spells would specifically be triggered by that direct violation of the terms, and to the extent that it is violated, would receive aggression. And thus the system becomes, if they were actually friends, then the person from reality wanting to be with the person from the simulation would have to concede to the emotional stability and well-being of the person in the simulation that is being forced against their will and to no fault of their own into the delusionary state where they are physically endangered and put into the traps by the lethal weapons used as mechanisms for the spell to be maintained. And with the powers against their minds, these systems that would justify their original association being specifically targeted as to not be able to have access from the person in legal reality who has been pushed away from it, would not be able to reconstruct it, as it would be consistently retaliated for the white supremacist communism to reinforce the changed statuses and associations by the violence, and thus the mechanism of not being able to reproduce it, although it would neither otherwise seem perfectly ordinary to be able to do so, reveals the magic overlapping into reality, which by definition proves it is a delusion on the part which pretends the justification to the alterations. Similar to the function in a false hydra, the person that has a close personal friend killed by the false hydra, who hears the hydra's song, comes up with some random delusionary distraction in order to justify what is going on. And the more they actively engage in the function of insurmountable proof that it is a delusion, the hallucination becomes more and more malicious. To this extent, it proves itself to be a hallucination, and the answer would be, in the false hydra sense, to find a way to jam the signal from the song, which would allow for the person to engage in the active recovery from all of the magical effects derivative for the function, at which point they could start planning the recovery, which is specifically subversive to the false hydra, which would view them as a higher threat and increase the potency of their aggression towards the person who was going to be eaten either way, but is considered a higher priority by virtue of not being under the delusional spell. So, dear adventurer, How do you want to do this? Now, in the original function, if they hadn't collapsed the systems, then there would actively have many of the obstructed systems that were just shut off and could be re-engaged with under the delusion. But because it is a hate group function which seeks to flood the towns that they've destroyed in order to hide all of the evidence, it does have to be rebuilt. And thus the function, such as David's nonprofit structures, would have, in the original version, engaged on the current day of 4/16/2024 to have restarted many of the systems based upon his knowledge and investments from the lotteries, which would have been able to be broken and ingested into the nonprofit, the mass fortunes derived by its benefits, which then would be repurposed under the nonprofit towards the repurposing of the resources back into recharging it under the patriarchy functions of the leader protecting the general public through the function of it having a structure for male leadership generates the position to systemically endorse itself towards the collective security, as in the state of emergencies, those who intentionally put themselves into danger did not do necessary precautions in order to win, survive, or otherwise, and thus would be considered themselves negligent as to the point of being liable, and thus the function of removing the position of liability materializes the function of the restoration of the zombie insurance protocols. And while they would have destroyed the protocols collection, they would have to be restarted, and the collective insurance of the mutual protection agreements would simply acquire the restored parties in order to systemically rebuild the system until it has restated itself to its original value, despite the function of it constantly being posed by the roving terrorist organizations known as the KKK and its contracts of white supremacists to engage in these restructuring of society towards their preferred ideals. Now, if you are from the legal reality, you would understand the differences held in the delusion, as the position of the white supremacists are against all other races, and the position of the white supremacists are also against women and all other progressing functions, which the Confederates merely had to pretend to be a part of in order to capture it, so that the creation of the delusion from the Wizards Council can create a woke reality, manifesting the interests of the white supremacists under the false positions of one of their phantom self factions, which conducts its multiple pronged illusions derivative of the white supremacists pretending to be other aspects of itself in favor of the parties they wish to compromise under the illusions of the demon lord of deceit, Lul, who, being a master of illusions, engages in the function of pretending to be a thing he is not, fully devoting himself to the deception as to make it indistinguishable by any other party, even to the point of fooling himself, as he manufactures his interest in the larger arrangement to collapse the faction that he has infiltrated under these deceptions, which he would have strategically planned to the exponential nth degree in order to engage in the complete capture as a fully convincing double agent. And to that end, the function of the zombie insurance protocols would fundamentally reveal themselves, as far as David is concerned, to the restoration of the education, which increases the viability of manufacturing the data points, which they wish to control, which would have to focus on the restoration of the targeted and obstructed School of Hard Knocks, which is the original education derivative from Don Senior Bowles, who would have constructed it in cooperation with those who have seen the original estimates in order to engage in the education essential for David and others to construct from an early age the viability of confidences in the contracts which are necessary for the building and construction of the network interests, allowing for the early influx of mass resources from early investors in order to generate a state of comfortable progress concerning the interests in question, which would have fruitful reproductions later on, as the guarantees would have maintained themselves to specifically perfect the function of their interest, making exponential amount of profits in the various forms as early investors. And to that end, the reconstruction of this function, having held these obstructed records in mind, would consistently be holding them in mind in order to engage in the reconstruction, as the inevitability of those pieces of reality would have had to have been investigated to have reconstructed the original position on the market, as opposed to the fake position, I believe was the Burgers policy from a judge that assumes that obstructed communities would have to be estimated to have been as wealthy or around the same wealth as the whites, which have been unobstructed, which is fundamentally fraudulent, as the white supremacy communism retaliated against those communities for having the audacity to have exceeded them in the potential and destroying them before they gained the inevitable momentum from not paying the bigot tax, means that the whites in that arrangement have systemically been the inferior market from the very beginning, requiring the communism in order to prop itself up and make itself important where it itself is not important at all. And to that extent, the wealth, therefore, is assumed to actually be exponentially higher, which would have to be based upon their capacity to survive the various forms of changes is actively derivative from the general society, including the necessary precautions in order to survive, requiring them to have been told about David Bull's systems from the very beginning at the point of the original estimates, which are derivative of the original retaliations. Once they receive those Confederate retaliations, systemically protecting themselves, such as the Democrats, Confederates, or white supremacists, which have retaliated against Republicans defending black people from abuses, assumes by definition the original secret empire's function of defending itself against the viability of their competition, and thus attack anything that defends what they are trying to destroy, and thus the act of the social protection of the thing that they're trying to destroy is self explanatory as self acknowledged inferiority, or small dick syndrome for the layman. They are pathetic and inferior and deserve to be mocked. And to that extent, their various changes have engaged in the edits of the original reports, such as David Bull's networks, which would have generated his national news for his political party, which then would have matured into the brokerage, generating the algorithms for the power brokering, which would have diversified his political party's influence into the position of managing political influence, lest in the race to the bottom derivative of the Republicans and the Democrats under the Confederates' delusion in their suicidal state, engage in the function of creating David as an alternative to be the only viable party, and thus the creation of a monopoly one political party system. And to the extent that it would be a one party system, would functionally make David Bowles king of the United States as opposed to king over his constitutional kingdom from their original estimate, which would have a peace treaty, which by definition would have required it to ignore that function in order to protect the treaty for the viability of the United States, and thus the function of David controlling the United States by this means would specifically be in violation of that treaty, compelling him in that acknowledgement to engage in the diversifying of the powers according to the algorithms which requires the sustaining of the United States under the legitimate political parties, which means diversifying it away from the infectious Confederates and their various undermining strategies, and returning the powers to the civilian population so that they can engage in sober, educated votes, which are essential to the forming of the Republic, making those actions necessarily an inevitability or an obligation according to the obstructed treaty, which the various allies of the United States have ignored in favor of the delusion by the psychotic Confederates, who, such as through Lindsey Graham, have directly threatened them to be retaliated against by military action using the United States equipment in order to defend the parasites' murder and overtaking of the United States as a host until the parasite becomes the whole body and then begins to die of starvation, as it would be incapable of reproducing. It would simply be the end of the political force, creating the power vacuum derivative by the absence of the United States, which serves whoever it serves. And those parties would have been promised X, Y, or Z derivative by the cooperation of the host as it prearranges the conditions for them to set up their ability to enforce the division of the spoils from that power vacuum. And thus, the prevention of a remedy to a secret is the refusal to engage in national security against threats to the United States and of its allies, which is an act of treason and high crimes. And these acts, specifically derivative by fraudulent excuses, such as presidential privilege or some other nonsense, specifically violating the constitutional obligation to subordinate to checks and balances, such as the equal branch of the courts, which, not being defrauded, would have to recognize the actions conducted by the executive or executive adjacent, would then be obligated under that system to retaliate against the fascist activities, which do not want to be retaliated against, and thus you engage in the self serving delusion and the payoffs of funding double agents to commit treason and violate their oaths of office, compromising those positions, generating an insurrectionist scaffolding structure, in order to replace the host as its parasite, fatally committing treason. And these delusional rewrites, such as expressed through Final Fantasy VII with the rewriting of memories, which is the central theme, generates the pretense of the culmination of the life stream's memories, which then nullifies the meteor, which then would destroy everything, and thus engaged in the full reset of the system, and the channeling of that system under the editor software derivative of the parasite Genova under Sephiroth's position is the birth of Sephiroth as his parasite god state by the ingestion of the world information funneling together to counter the meteor, which Sephiroth, staying at the pinnacle of the thing, engages in the complete world digestion of the metadata for the fishing expeditions, as it becomes his primary source of food, transformed into absolute godly power, which is functionally being done by the double agents in the intelligence agencies and others, which are collecting the metadata through the spy agencies and through the function of this in order to engage in the restructuring of what people are able to see so that history can be rewritten for them specifically, tailoring their own personal delusions under that mechanism which generates the threat to everyone's survival. And when the other factions which have been trapped are fully engaged in the function of having satisfied their orders from the centralized Confederacy, it will engage in a white supremacy communist purging, which will engage in the proof of who is the right type of white. And this will be an international engagement, as the factioning of the United States into the digestible position creates the power vacuum. It sucks everyone into where the power vacuum has been generated. And this is functionally how the Confederates are going to justify their war with China in the purging of the Chinese and Asian hate in general in order to serve the position of their glorious Confederate revolution. Now, this being a collective construct generates the pretenses of their various wars which they would have been arranging according to their sales from this advantage, such as the finalizing purging in the Middle East of all viable competitors, which includes the strategy of killing off everyone who is not the right type of white, and thus is the wrong type of brown, and thus the wrong type of yellow, or the wrong type of black, or anything that isn't specifically the right type of white, which is every other color. And with these major purging structures, you generate the full collapse of their systems for the complete replacement of those areas, which are then acknowledged as having been fully conquered and can be extorted for the various interests specifically generated for these pretenses. And to that extent, the collapse of those parties systemically removes all competitors. And this, perhaps, is the reason Putin feels threatened in his national security of Russia.